나는 이행한다 등한지 밀리아 네 동화간에 용거였어. 동화디게 되네 용거였어. 동화고였어. 되네 동화고였어네. 내 동화디 영화에 규견디게 당한 저기 녀몽발에 되네 용거였어. 녀몽발에서 알레라 된딘 제불이고래. 제가 당한 동화디 미디어 봐서 동화대 타고 봐서 다 라니 몽바나 소소라라 디니시 동화 용어는 뺏사사리 제가 몽바나 동화디 딘 녀몽어디 제고도 동화디라 타고서 삼제 동화야 유 녀몽발에 녀보텐제 만주게네 도시냐면 제디 제화디 김제 제 동화 시하고 비다 고바디 김사로 있는데 레스는 것들이 쇼게 되네 쉬로와.
Good afternoon. So this morning we looked at a further presentation on sufferings that humans experience. And again, the purpose of looking at this topic over these last many weeks is that we need to reflect on suffering, coming to really recognize it so that a deep aversion arises, leading us to seek out its causes. And independent on this deep aversion, when we recognize the causes of our suffering, we want to be freed of them, to gain a state freed of them. And thereby, we'll strive to cultivate the antidotes, the paths that are required to gain freedom from suffering. So this is what we continue to look at this morning.
베네 제바던 꼼바던 사와던 사랑의 동아 데네게 종의 동아 데네 아니 지기 dunru의 동아 나신 아니 현지 눈쇼다 녀의 동아 나신 밀레뇨아 요래 세팅도 되는 시대 난 디지 동아디게 나 말아도 다데 내가 말아도리아 누에 미도 다데 내가 삼다나 데네게 동아디게 됐어 제곰다 사랑의 동아다 종 동아 강아 되셔서 여름마다 신 강아 첨부 디제 매년의 동안 하신다 눈의 동안 하신 어떤 용어가 아주 매로하다 예 맞아 당은 되니기 리딘디 당은 두체 삼다데 다데 소식이 리딘이 배 맞아 야고 되니게 강아디게 되셔서 차라다 조금 동안에 되셔서 갑자기 까마 가시라면 매디게 되니게 인자 되니게 삼다외나 언제 배면서 야고 차려요 되니 인자 되니게 소식이 리딘이나 데네 다디네 칼로 강아디다 자두 자와디 배하고 중시에서 배 삼다다 데네 토네 다 몽어번에 강아디다 마체비 다 데네게 탑람디 여버에서 탑람디 아주 배절했다네 다데 데네 제고를 해야 되는 중에 탑람디 디 여버디 아주 배지나 제시게 하셔가디 델레티네 가서 하고 엔자다 데네 탑람도 몽어번에 데네게 마기게 탑람딩이 지긴 세비 심주기야다 데네게 제야디 고급로아디 디링 아주 두시네 다 저기도 롭장 전에 신바데 빼야고래 선비게 당은 수수 만줄이야 데네기 돈에 땡기 차내래 안 데네기 내수인 강아 체에게 강아 세답 탑람디게 먼저 하고 데네기 되네 인자들 될래되는 거 저기 일이야 가와기야 당 데네 보와기야 당 데네 먼저기 데네기 몽반나 소소라 데네 마야리야 안 심슈 제제 탑람들 제긴 비주 지긴 선배선 봐야 돼 아니 개체 뭘 차고로 와
When one engages in this meditation, part of the purpose or the benefits of this meditation is when one is looking at the way suffering is presented, at the illustrations, one first looks at one's own lived experience. What have I experienced the sufferings presented, such as hunger and thirst, heat and cold, and so forth. And of course, one recognizes one has done so. Then one also, though, recognizes that the suffering experiences that I've encountered in this life are not unique to me. All other humans have experienced these. And when I compare myself to other humans, so many have these same suffering experiences, but greatly amplified, far worse than I have experienced them. And when I look beyond the experience of humans to non-humans, we see that humans suffer in ways that are similar to those in the various lower realms, but our suffering is greatly reduced compared to them. So when you're looking at it in this lens, it helps us to gain a more balanced, realistic approach or view of the sufferings that we do experience. And this we can utilize to recognize how actually fortunate we are. And we are in this incredibly fortunate position because of the causes we have accumulated. Those causes, though, have ripened, and when their potential is exhausted, those ripening results will come to an end. Therefore, it's imperative that I strive to accumulate similar causes again, or causes so that I experience similar results again. I do not want to suffer in the way that so many others in our world, as well as in the non-human worlds, are suffering. But not only must I strive to accumulate those causes, I know I can do so because I'm experiencing the results of having accumulated similar causes in the past. So this is a key recognition because it gives us a sense of confidence that I can do this. I can let go of what has no real value. I can let go of what causes harm, and I can rather focus on what has value and strive to accumulate the causes for happiness. So this is a skillful way to relate to the Dharma because it develops our confidence. It also helps us to see in a more realistic way just what we have achieved and thereby come to actually recognize more clearly our actual potential. So now we'll continue with where we concluded this morning and look at the suffering of demigods on page 164. The demigods, they find themselves situated between the worlds of humans in terms of their experience of happiness and suffering. They find themselves situated between the worlds of humans and those of gods. So the demigods, they experience a far greater comforts and happinesses than humans, but nothing compared to that of gods. So they find themselves in between the two. Of the realms of existence, they're divided into two, lower and higher realms. Higher realms can be divided into two, humans and all the gods together, or into three, humans, demigods, and gods.
Midal hani parala chidada nganjoge tu nganjo sumda dendro ni se midal ha se de nga chi shabaina mi dendro nganjo sumche nyawa ida dendro sumche tene hada mi se de nga ji zhuwa nga ji beina zhuwa nga jang ge baina da lama yin se de da jang ge go marwa lama na ne gari na dugre se da dendro ne re mi na dugre he na dugre lamna papa thomes ne lei khong da le dugre se o lei khong da na dugre se Papa Tomegi Galagosne, drawing a Tibina, on the draw Druk Jangaze, Danga Jangaze, Nyungore, drawing Druk Jangazen, Yawaida, Dundo Sumche, Midal Hada, Lama Ins, and the Sum, then Druk Sigorada. Drawing a Jangaze, Yawaida, Dundo Sumgando Sumche, then Hada missing a Atisha Gore. Then Hada missing a Tibineta, that Lama Ins said, Zio Marvat, that Lama in the Yana, Minani or Hanani in Gore. Karikun degree lamna 바고 도매기 라마인데 회의호들 두고래서 송거래.
So you'll come across in text the divisions of the realms of samsara, usually into 6, but sometimes into 5. So the difference is not about the lower realms, that remains as 3, but whether the higher realms are presented as 2 or 3. So some will present it as 2, humans and gods. But Sangha, for example, he rather divided the god realms into gods and demigods. But where you come across a division of a 5-fold division, demigods are included within or amongst gods.
이다다 둔조나를 뒤로 같이 둔조요래 같이 이다나를 요래서 데 라마인세디 둔조게 직직다 나라 라마인세디 가브리 같이 이다기 직직나를 요래지 진짜 라마인세 해나를 뒤고 말마 둔조다 안지 안쪽이 고날 맞으로 그래서 이제 순거래 안도 되나나 어디네 순거도 또 하시나
in a teaching from the Buddha recorded in the Sutra of Mindfulness, there the presentation for demigods is a bit different. So it will be the 5-fold division, but demigods are not included amongst gods, but some are included amongst spirits, and some are included amongst animals. So that's a less common, an uncommon presentation, but found in the Sutra of Mindfulness.
단 dondalang anju nomjin draw rijuk tsi ane draw rijuk tsi jo or ma ji jion chane draw rijuk tsi go draw rijuk tsi yode de ne lama yin se de mile de sanwa da la le lo so chen de koron de ji de sen ji shin draw rijuk tsi de de tsi go dang anju de di go ma jion ge chane she ba ne dang anju ka re ne da de draw rijuk tsi be na ne da jion de da lama yin se de la le de mile sanwa da la le de jo de di to ne da shu ya de.
The presentation in our text is the common presentation. So I just mentioned the other presentations because one may come across them and they are valid. What we have here is the most common presentation of the 6-fold division of realms. And then in that 6-fold division, the higher realms have 3, the humans, then demigods and gods. And demigods are situated explicitly between humans and gods.
나 니니게다 라마인들의 동화 가르강아 가르요래 람나 라마인들아 가요로스네 라마인 남리 뻘줄 뮤지비게 차도기 이동라스 델라데네 하당 탑나 류제바나 자와라 소유 동화 두마뇽와당스 엔데남 셰럽단데야 네밍기 디바제 임베 아니 덴델라 통람운도 아니 통람 Lama
Tsongkhapa writes, it is said that the demigods are mentally tormented by jealousy that cannot bear the wealth of the gods. When based on that they fight with the gods, they experience many sufferings of having their bodies chopped up, split and the like. Although they possess intelligence, they have fully ripened obstructions and consequently cannot see the truth while in that body.
지나다 라마인디게 레가선 차도 침보여레스 지나다 늘 바다도 하되게 변주를 야가다 직변주를 가는 튕겨내 야가 통로도 안 할야 차도 계제 안 하게 변주 건설이야 마 냠차 나야 돈달이야 직고 투부 겹제 마제기를 쓰도데 마제다 당은 밀레 마제 뭐 용거로 와다 직 대사 개합 직변주를 얘기해줘도 고 야고 차사선 될이야 안에 지게 냐와 땅지 파 껴서야 되는 지고로 와대 가지고 어디네 고도 디나신다 라마인디게 할야도 할디게 변조야다 튕겨야가 지기 통어들 안에 직파 차도 계제 안데서야 차도 인지는 할야 쭉 투부 접제 마제고래서는 차도 회의 변조라 미세바 회의 변조되다 될야 지금 미세바 차도 계제 안 차도 이동에서 이동의 차도는 배세 맞지버자 다 고도 야기로 한간들 하게 야가도 배 사디 셈 맞지버 차제 되는 tele tenen thala tabana se hala maje gores maje du tene ane maje du ane chik 다 하긴 하다 파 마게도 되네 하게 수미 마게도 소수가 라만디게 지금 강바 제바 류 제바 근데 고 제바라서 바다 되네게 류를 마셔 발라서 바 되네게 동아 빠도면 봐 용거야 차고래 해세제
So it is said that demigods are mentally tormented by jealousy that cannot bear the wealth of gods. So whilst demigods, their material situation greatly exceeds that of humans in terms of their wealth and luxury and so forth, and their sense pleasures, they can observe the gods, and they see that the gods have far superior wealth, luxury, and power, and particularly here the desire realm gods. And this leads to, just like amongst humans, jealousy arising. And just like among some humans, this jealousy then will be acted upon, and they act out in an unskillful way, an afflicted way. So we see that these beings, the demigods, still afflicted and act under the control of their afflictions. When, based on that, they fight with the gods. So under the influence of their afflictions, they engage in battle with the gods, where the gods are superior in terms of not just wealth and luxury, but also their power. So these battles do not go well for the demigods. They repeatedly are lose and experience the sufferings as described here.
나래 왕치중도 토네 왕치에 되게 중요하리야 강아제야다 되네게 동아제야 뭐 여러 와다 딘하시다 되네게 제가 디수샤사 레다 녀모 왕기 개와 렘바이나 하마이나 개와 렘바이나 동아 딘데는 용고도 와서 삼다이 와다.
What we recognize here is that governed by the afflictions, these less powerful beings are engaging in conflict with powerful beings with a predictable result. They end up being chopped up and split and so forth. In other words, gravely wounded. Because of the strength of their afflictions, they keep engaging in battle like this, despite once again being harmed. So here we see some tie over with what we have in the other realms, where in that the beings act under the control of their afflictions. Those with power are easily able to dominate those without power. So we see this tie over here, and here the reflection is on the suffering that beings in samsara, such as these, the demigods, experience.
나서 삼다와 나녀 콜외 동안에 인보민도 셈비 코알레 강 두삼다 코알레 인보메 바통 델리아 예중에 탈바 토부도 셈비 도 데네기 삼다네 아니 잠기 가소레 데네기 진보 추전 세바 준저라 소바 냠는지네 안 냠는지 람 귤레게와 용고래 잔주심남에 아니 잔주심이 대 유교로 여러 와다 지바래 요래 어디 냠는 지게 요레스 아마엘레 말이다 당볼레다 사바 기기로 와데 잠니지 귤레게네 사바 게어라데 제자다 코왈레 간주 대시셰바는 코왈 두스 닝보메바 통 되는 코왈레 탈두게 삼바게 되는 탈바 토부 선배서 되는 탈바 토예기 되나려야 메중게네 되는 잠 가서 짐어 수준서버 준료금 삼대 곰제네 가서 두시는 곰바 용고레스 냠네 제바냐 람귤레 게와 유아 용고레 되네 잠니지 곰제 전시심 귤레 게와 용고레스.
Whilst the dominant, whilst the vast majority of demigods are overwhelmed by jealousy, their minds are dominated by jealousy and therefore conflict. This isn't all pervasive amongst all demigods. There are certainly those who are born there with extensive virtue. They can recognize that samsara has no abiding value, and they develop definite emergence, and they accumulate virtuous minds such as generosity, ethical restraint, and so forth. They can even generate bodhicitta. So this is so for some demigods, they utilize their excellent existence in a meaningful way, cultivating minds of Dharma.
Karsore, Nyomoche, Mongbore, the Mille Yamnechi, Lam Yamnechi, Yorba, Dinajin Chigwachagor, the Lama said the Gile, the Niki Nyomoche, and the Tusuchenda, then Chago Chimo Mongo Yevaje, and the Anji Dinale, Lama Inale, giving Yamnechi, Yamnechi, and the Jinzo Passion, Jimba, the Tudum Loss by Yamnechi, Jamni Yanaje, Janju Semba, Yedir, what I didn't.
So here we see a clear parallel to the human realm, in that, just like in the human realm, beings are dominated by their afflictions, but nevertheless, some still recognize that samsara has no abiding value, and thereby strive to cultivate definite emergence, love, compassion, bodhicitta, and virtuous minds such as generosity, ethics, patience, and so forth. So too with the demigods. But the vast majority, just like with humans, follow their afflictions, dominated by their afflictions, follow their afflictions.
Denam Sherabdan Denyang, Nemin Divachen Imbe, Den de la Demba Osum Demba Tondo Mirun or Sung Sohosa.
In this final sentence, although they possess intelligence, they have fully ripened abstractions and consequently cannot see the truth while in that body.
Denam Sherab the Denya, Sidu, that Denigi Dundwana Lumbo, Denigi Ganya Jeba Chemashing Dene Mares, Denigi, Denigi Jeba Cheshing, but Dene Jam Niji Lam Yamne, Kori Dungagi, Dewata Dungagi, Namie Dungagi, that you, Numobati, Hako, Numobigi, Nubotina de Hako, and the Dene Sherab, Dene Dame Toba, Tony Tobola Sobat, Dene Sherab the Demba Yungores. Jesa dine lam nyamlin chene tsetele ya an solam na jolam jewa de yungores. Yine ya da konzo karyosene nemingi diwa shukchimbo yores, legi diwa shukchimbo yores. Dine inza tsetele ya tonglam yune kitu mares or tonglam kitu mare, pape go wang top tu mares, lam gazin nyamlin cheba na den dele horon lamanyi den dele ya solam kitu gure jolam jeya yungores, ato tonglam kitu mares or da.
These beings, demigods, they, like humans, can come to recognize the faults of samsara, and thereby, through reflecting on suffering and coming to know suffering, and reflecting on the origins of suffering, giving rise to the determined attitude to abandon their afflictions, and give rise to a yearning to bring about a cessation of, or cultivate a cessation of suffering, they then strive in cultivating the various mental paths. So in this way, they can develop, through meditating on the Four Noble Truths, develop definite emergence, and from this they can also, in the way described this morning, use this as the preliminary to meditate on love and compassion and generate bodhicitta. Whichever path they follow, whatever route they follow, they can newly generate either the Mahayana or the Theravada path of accumulation and develop that further into the path of preparation. So these demigods can practice and attain such a quality of realization. However, they cannot realize emptiness directly. They cannot progress to the path of seeing, just as far as the path of preparation.
Dene ma leyu dunga she dire da lama yi dine she da lama leyu go she dire.
So that there is the meaning of the word truth, which would be seeing emptiness directly. And while in that body, usually that's translated as in that life, not body, body is literal. So in that life, as a demigod, they cannot realize emptiness directly. Now, on to the next, the suffering of gods.
Then hadile yang rigni yongor that debegi la seda ne kasuri kam gomel ha sel halba rigni che.
The suffering of gods, we see that there are two gods themselves, not excluding demigods. Gods can be classed as two: the suffering of desire realm gods and the suffering of gods of the uppermost realm. So what we just looked at is the demigods. They are also part of desire realm gods. The desire realm gods have both demigods and full gods. And now we look specifically at the full gods of the desire realm, and thereafter at the gods of the uppermost realms.
So now we
come to look at the suffering of gods with those two divisions into gods of the desire realm and gods of the form and formless realm, or the uppermost realms.
And the Bakong Dunga and Jebadan, Davalas, Davadan, Subadan, Jubidunga laws. The Dunga descend sum the chase, the negative sum the Sundua.
So looking at the suffering of desire realm gods, this has 3 points. Firstly, the suffering of dying, transmigrating and falling. Secondly, the suffering of jealousy. Thirdly, and the sufferings of being chopped up, split, killed and banished.
On that day, in Chipo, the Dunga said, Delia, and down with Ni Chase and Chipo Dunga said, near Omar Dunga Dunga said, near Dine, near Omar Kido, Dunga, near Omar Dunga law said, that had Delia carriers, Chivi Dunga Yores, the near and Chinima near Omar Dunje, my Benel, Midang, and the Nyawada, Dundota, Idalma Kido Dunga Yores. She said, Neoma Huma Sani, Tadil Haliki Dirua. She said, Tadil Haliki Dirua, Hale Oma Mida Dundo de Girua, she said, Delma Yegi to my origin.
So of the 3 types of suffering of desire realm gods, look at the first, the suffering of dying, transmigrating and falling, which is itself divided into 2 subpoints, the suffering of dying and transmigrating, and then separately, the suffering of falling to a lower abode. So lower abode refers here to lower than a desire realm god. So the realm, including then humans as well as the lower realms.
On that the Chipo Dunga Carriores and Dambo that did Ngaran Hin Devala Long Jebes, Long Jebala Juve, Devales, Chipovece, and Chide Ngatonwana, Dele Juve Dunga, Chewa Jungos.
So look at the suffering of dying and transmigrating. At the time of dying and transmigrating, when a god has seen the 5 signs of death, the suffering that springs from this is far greater than the happiness that previously arose from enjoying the delights of gods.
Namshi said that said it all, she again some land, Yoshi said somebody land, that she again, Chivi get Daxan Masona, Nayungurella, Chipuesi, Chidengas and Chiegi, that Yoshi get Daxan Rosona, Nayunguries, the name I ordered that tell you do not bother me by Newabanaji, do my shoes, do my shoe Chimuki or Chechawa, do not bother me by Chimuki.
After experiencing a long life that was filled with unimaginable delights, where God's having remarkable resources, all their sense pleasures are fully satiated over an extensive lifespan. When their death approaches, their suffering is immense, recognizing just what has now come to an end. Their suffering then is actually likened to that of a hell being in this final period of their life.
난 지대 응아디 가려운 것은 난 류이 카도 미두바 세야지 류이 카도 민베 걸어서 수보디게 짱마데 아니지게 닝지오라시 여러와다 카도 야보여라 제가 되니게다 지얘기 다산 레도 베 류이 카도 되기 바 유르시네 베 지금 윤이 야오메바라 제 차야를 용구서라 류이 카도 미두바 세야지 되는 때는 미가와 세대 소소기 되사게 내다 되니게 빼잘라디기 가서래 될 가보메지가 가서는 닝바로 자 쪼바라시 통제 될다 마가 빼 넘윤데 빼 장마 이슈 지여도 다데 되니게다 닝바로 다 되니게 리마카야다 쪼바라 통제 되는 빼 윤이 될래 되게 가보 균이 메지가 강아 미가와 되네 매도 창원 닝바스 넘기는 거라서 매도 사와 배 닝지 거라지 매도 창원 다야다 되네 여디로와 제가 다시 얘기 다선래도 매도 제한시도 닝바를 차로 거래 제 닝바 닝조 매 닝바를 차네 되네 두신에 뉴용거레스 아니 그래라 디마 잡아 소소가 둘로되네 배지 디마단 조거라지 디마 카드셔 되네게 되네 류리야 문나망고 예망 문나네 다디 문나 마마의 디마 수분 디마 가야 자요레스 지난 되네게 다생가를 내용 제가 되네도 다 넘균데 강한 매지 끼우지 되되갑라 되네게도 다 되네기 토네 배 마스셈이야 동화 쉬우시리 거래지네.
To understand the suffering of their impending death, one needs to imagine living a life of complete joy and ecstasy where one only experiences pleasures. Therefore, when one is approaching death, it's not that one's conditions are just getting worse, like it is for ourselves, but things they personally have never experienced are now happening for the very first time. So we're reading here, not reading on, there are 5 signs of death. For them now, as individuals, this is the first time something like this has ever happened to them over this extensive life. So firstly, their complexion changes, it becomes hideous. Secondly, their seats, or their home, what they abide in, this suddenly becomes uncomfortable. So they're experiencing discomfort, physical discomfort for the first time. Their body has become unpleasant to observe for the first time. And even their flower garments, their ornaments, these now wilt, and their clothes start to smell, and they sweat, things which I have never personally experienced before.
나 되네기 남균이 걸어서미 장마당 되네 하나 제게 자야동에 대 강함에 장마 수부디에 장마 매도게 되네 매도 창화디에 사와 지가리네 지디여와 다 되네기 유디갑라 되네기 다 닝바차 쪽바차 지마카야 도도 되네기니 지 강아 쉬우실레디가 다디 용고레세 다디 되네기 동가디게 다 강아 먹을리고레제리다 다 치대 나세 다
So for us then really to appreciate what they are encountering, we need to be clear that they've only ever lived in a clean and comfortable environment without any blemish, in terms of their body too, without any blemish. All their possessions, everything has just been remarkable, beyond perfect. And now suddenly it is all changing.
디 간주에 냠녀라시 여러와다 가지 남기네 제게 미상 야보 부부 미상 야보 강아 균에 태면야 사야 동야다 변조 톤에 강아미 되게 되사디게 배 장마 칼라디게 게디네 야보라세 데네 미네 게디나 아직 귀샤 제팅하다 미상 야보 부부라 지여베나 근데 데네 남기네 데네기도 신의 직되되되 아니 지 여러와다 이유를 쇼라다와 나 님이 지 lumba shenda ji lia jiu ji na la lumba sa ji jiu 아니 지금 저사디게 장을 매디게 디네 강아 스트리트여도 데네 강아 심부라다 제술이야 샘텔 마지고 쉬고 첨부하래 넘균네 강아 나를 되게 미디 디네 사진 강아 질레네 셔자 강아 요마 도루버래 셔라 믹스기 강아 체 좋아해서 요마래 진짜 넘균 디네기 제딩게르다 강아 직투도 디네 강아 첨부 쉬고 치차고라다 디디 뭐도 밀레 요로와다 디네게 나디네게 대견하더미 대치에 되게 디와 주엔디게미 오늘 튕겨야고 아니 사제되게 장라야고 아니 제조 좀 해봐 배 회시시 돼야 지겨워다 나디는 마도제 내 루버šan다 교부 정세티와 지gle 되네 되네 상초디게네 지 야고 메되게 되사다 되네 로다 되네게 추다 다다로 지메베네 배 강아 돼야다 대 정섭 나네 되게 미디게 강한 용어를 디제게 심ля 강한 효마고 넘준의 디제에서 그 지과로 저리 샤샤 강한 말. 나 결혼 미직 되네 바디고 아지 되네 스트로베나 다 믹스이 강한 쇼다. 디 강한 요르베. 디나 시리다 하디게래 되네게 요가서 되네 야고 요되지 제래 되네게 체야도 되네 믹스이 강한 셈체 체체 리고로다.
In relation to human experience, one can imagine someone who has wealth and status and prestige, and their children are well behaved and they have an excellent relationship with their partner. So really the idyllic life. And then suddenly it all goes wrong. Perhaps a grave natural calamity, or they are immediately have to flee the country, they become refugees, and they're now living in a filthy environment with no status, no possessions, nothing to protect them, surrounded by impoverishment and filth. Suddenly, it's all changed and it's all gone. So that is something similar. Or perhaps, having lived one's whole life here in this really comfortable, clean environment, and one, for whatever reason, is required to move to another country where things are still very undeveloped. And one is living somewhere where there's no plumbing, there's no running water, there's no electricity, and things are actually quite filthy. So for those local people there, for them, this is all they have ever known. But for ourselves, suddenly having to try and cope with such a situation, this would be really difficult. And the mind, of course, would get gravely unhappy from this.
메당고라 탑는 메당고라 신당 메당고라 당은 두스 아주 치료하는 야 좋아싱아 주와야 데스 얘기 디와지는 아주 데스 장하로 뒤고로와다 되네 야 좋아제 두스테디움 메당고로와 메당도 되네 도 진 메데데 도와 먹고 된 거로와 탈라 먹으라 된메 가브리리 두스 메 신디도 두진 메 마도 푸신 푸야고로와 포게도 도와서 라랑도 하진 마제 도어데일에 돌이 탈라데 되제 간마데 강자와나시 두신 수쿠수와레 차사 둘로 쏘버래 되네 나중에 장 푸동이 요건 거로와 니 푸동지게 차사 나보차로 되네 질로 마드네 둘로 나 두어 디마스나 둘로 가 주디도와 된 질로 마드 둘로 디마 가기도 하든 도와드리면까지도 다 등한 스텝에 쪼고도 이제 소우도 하다가 저게 제산 남유 조셉 데슬레 디네 코르디로 와데 제라믹스에 소화스가요 말아 먼저 딘디시 아타지 제메신 셈비 도와 푸게 메 마르는 캬그로와 데네 푸르 마제네 메 발그마라든 푸게 신야 중요데 데네 도와 탈라체 야 남라라 덴 마강 제바나 두신 수보 차사 자자 데네 락바디게 되스디와 투신에 낙보차네 나고서 넘지 장모로와 나고자 되는 가르치래 세가게 맞춰야 되는 것도 하대. 제자디 강아된 간들에 넘준 직 대디간들 용거래. 제자디 간들 용거다 할래데 디 도와지니 강한 이거로 하다.
And certainly this is how people in undeveloped parts of the world live. Certainly the area I grew up in was like this. We had no electricity. When we wanted to warm up our home, the only way to do that is to light a fire. When you wanted to cook food, we cooked on that fire. So we'd have a wood stove, and that's what we'd use to heat our home and to cook. When you're making a wood fire, you put the wood inside, you light it, but then you need to blow on it to stimulate the fire. What happens? Because you're using a used hearth, you will get a whole lot of ash back in your face, and that will make your face dirty, and it'll make your clothes dirty. And what you're going to do, other than cough, because you now also got a mouthful of smoke, you can go outside and wash your face in icy water. You're not going to wash your clothes because there's only icy cold water to wash. There's no washing machine. And anyway, when later in the day you make another fire, it's all going to happen again. So this is just normal life. You're dirty. You smell of smoke. Your skin is dark from ash, and your clothes are just dirty. That is how it is. That is normal existence. And if in your daily chores you cut yourself, and there's no medical treatment, there's no treatment to aid your healing or to deal with pain, you just make the most of it. And this for myself when I was young, and many people in our world, this is just normal existence. We didn't have dirt and filth to deal with, but for many in our world, that too is a common occurrence.
Nyama Dorje do want you to go Yama do want to do then Tradition that venture the Kanga Jorwa. Chisa Sancho Manima Chixedu, the Saton Drew Jedima Chigir, the Rero capture Saguro, that Mimangura Chunu, the Nesadon in my over the gun, then March the Gangbasu Rameva, that Sancho Madonna, Madonna, Rodora. The Kangmasu Samara, Kangba Duava, the Chapa, and Chimba, the Ganju Mudua. Chisa Nansuable in the Sherasha, Zold and Sherasha Skangashayama, that's the Chiki, that just what could roll what they call Chiki, the name road, what in the Sanjama de la Madonna card or Josamindo at the one, the correct. She said that Nansum at the Chiki, that consecration in nothing that use Kayama shooting or down there.
I can think back to, now quite some decades ago, when the Kala Chakra was being offered in Bodh Gaya. So then the conditions were very poor. There really wasn't much, but there are a lot of people. So a lot of people, it means a lot of people going to the toilet. So, of course, there are just no toilets there. So they were cornered off a plot of land and cornered it off in terms of put material around. So that would be designated, that field would be the toilet. So for us, coming from our monasteries were undeveloped then, our homes that we had grown up in were certainly not developed either. So we would going there to the toilet in the field wasn't particularly uncommon. It wasn't a big deal for us. But as the days went by, there wasn't so much unsoiled soil. And so this, for us, wasn't so nice, because this we weren't so used to, but nevertheless, it wasn't so far from what we're used to. But we looked at the foreigners and we thought, what were they making of this? Because you're walking through excrement to do your business on other people's business. And this could not have been pleasant for them. And we wondered, what were they making of this situation?
Deni kabla ni chigi mi zeli kanga che yorwa da semdi nganzu numni chen local media duanda chigi mi de dine sanction na jode chigi mi de kanga shira che yorwa semdi che ma ju che ro da de dina jire da de.
What we see there is, for everyone, the situation was the same. But different people would experience that very differently. So there's something to be seen in that. And there's something both here and what we looked at this morning, how you experience the same thing very differently.
Di damde shara liro chigo maras. Da khonsu shanda ye zang maras dudu, an dine kable pa zhoya di pa zobo chane zhoyim chigo maras. Dine dele ya 라 로고 샨다디기 수 로고 용로 지고마 되네 심체 디강래 되는 심체 지고 샤고로 베나가 중에마 내염 포디카블야 지 내염 미시중가나 델바 미수이나 조야기 주고마 어고 고유레스네 배시나지는 주고마 디나신다 하디게 하디시에 미지 하지글야 되네게 대포 하이고 류딜야 짐바카야라서 와다 메도 니발라서 와 코이도 미두바 인버 젠디지 차드 하샨다디게 고잘 조야기 가부치고 말에 제가 말어도 되네 로고메바 로고 말에 강아 되네게 돈에 땅아 가부치고면 차사에 갈 가부치고면 나치 지보레 샤선베 되네 돈에 셈제 빼 셈마지고 강아 용걸 해지래.
What really adds to the suffering of dying for gods is that whilst they themselves have never experienced this, any of these signs, these sufferings before, they have observed them when other gods die. So they know what's coming. Also, the other gods, seeing them, want nothing to do with them. They know that particular god is dying, and they abandon them in disgust. They're filthy. They stink. They want nothing to do with them. They do not associate with them in any way. So this dying god now, for this really protracted, lengthy period that they are approaching death, they have lost everything: the splendor of their body, the splendor of their home, their splendid friends. All desert them. Nothing is there to support them, and they are approaching death alone. So we can liken this to the early months of the pandemic, when people died in hospitals, also isolated and alone.
나네네 오마 보에 동아 세티데 강아 가르여서 니 강아리 시월데 네 오마 니바니 시진리에 하이 지딘 다나 퍼발라 갈데 개월하마 가메나 데네 왕면 뒤로 이다다 냐와 네바 강야 롱어 교로 시송바 따로스.
Then the second suffering, the suffering of falling to a lower abode. In the same way, letter to a friend says, and just change the second and third line a little bit. As they transmigrate from the world of the gods, in the event that none of their virtue remains, they veer without control into the appropriate abode of animals, hungry ghosts, and beings of hell. All beings of hell.
Lai jiden dana pöbala galde ne gewa lama megal na dene omen duro ida da nyawa nebar ganya rungwa duro side da la hadigelia da 고로즈 문지 레기 원기 원시 용고래 개와 치마다 개와 마마디 통야라서 원시 용고래 세상다 하디 둥하디 가서 개와 치마게 가와 기기여바디 그런 통고하다 되는 시대 포야도 지대 포야도 다 고로즈 레기 원기 다 개와 치마 가와 기기여바디 통고래 세상다 되는게 마시네 기 개와 개위 냐마다 개와 사샤비게 제부 디기디체 사사하 레규라 리들의 민찰제 되는게 민찰 되는 개와도 다 되는 개와치마 동안 용과에 왕매도 내가 라와매 왕매도 야 뒤를 개와 가불을 뒤를 개와다 이다 개와다 냐와 개와 강도 개에게 내디 통고를 하러서 이 통고도 답변에 이다를 개와지 통고변에 다 되는게 강아 이다가 강아 통통도 다디 샘제 쉬우준 거로 냐와 동아 냐와 개에게 통해도 냐위 동아디 빠도면 용고가 통해 되는게 샘제 용고로 난 뒤돌에 개와 통해 뒤르길 다미 고주게 통해 뒤르 강아디게 통하진 되는게 샘제 되지 마신녀는 소소 강도 개에게 개색이 통고를 내려 오말 홍에 통 되네 배다 되는게 배사사서 되는게 다 샘제 쉬우 동안 용과에서 샘 마신녀네 많이 니 계지 동원고서 많이 년에는 레이텔이야 샘제되네 강아 빠도매 봐 용고를 해제라 내려 동아스 디시오래.
So looking at the whole verse, as they transmigrate from the world of the gods, in other words, as they are approaching death. So this is in this period in which death is approaching. in the event that none of their virtue remains. So what this refers to is that whilst they've been enjoying this long life of abundant pleasures, they will not have been accumulating virtue. They, blissed out in the ecstasy of their life. So they haven't been spending time accumulating virtue, but rather have been consuming virtue accumulated in lives previous to this. So when death comes, in the event that none of their virtue remains, they veer without control into the appropriate abode. In other words, they now lacking the virtue to be reborn as a god, they know where their next rebirth will be, because at the time in this death period, clairvoyance arises for them, whereby they can see where they'll be born. They can see the rebirth that they will take. So they know whether they are going to be reborn as an animal, a hungry ghost, or the beings of hell, or as a human being. So they can see where they're going to be born and what those circumstances are. And compared to their life of luxury and pleasure and comfort, it's an immense suffering, no matter where they are going to be born. It is so much beneath what they have really ever known throughout the length of this life. And there's nothing they can do. It is too late. They have not created the capacity to accumulate virtue in this final period. They are under the control, like every sentient being in samsara is, under the control of their karma at this point. Their karma is dictating their rebirth. They see their rebirth through their clairvoyance. And from this, they are mentally tormented by what awaits them. They can see what is before them. And they are desperate not to fall into that state, but they are helpless to prevent such a rebirth.
dene giving nyamne ne solam na jolam lam gyula kewa yungore dene ge jam ni je nyang so ne je janjo sim gyula ne janjo sim solam na jolam gyula kewa yungore jesa la ya dene ge yore ade tombai do wa solam na janjo sim solam na jolam se de so tombai do wa na tombai do yin ba ta ga jile 대신에 돈이 무슨 또 뭐도 기시기로 돈이 또 봐도 여러 되지 하마야라 소람다 절람 집바다 할래 다가래 데니기 냠리지네 데니기 잠니제 전주심 네 데니기 람 소람다 절람 길에 깨와 되는 용거를 해지래.
This is the situation for the vast majority of gods. But for some gods, they have take rebirth or attain rebirth in the God realms with sufficient imprints that they can utilize those imprints to accumulate virtue whilst gods. And here their situation in this regard is the same as that of some of the demigods, in that whilst abiding in the God realm with this body of a god and the delights of a god, they nevertheless have the imprints that they can reflect on the sufferings of samsara. And they can cultivate, through meditating on the Four Noble Truths, cultivate definite emergence and accumulate the causes for liberation, the minds of generosity, ethical restraint, and so forth. And they can attain a path of accumulation, path of preparation. And they can also meditate and cultivate love, compassion, and bodhicitta. So for some gods, this is their experience in gods, their experience as gods. They engage in cultivating the Dharma, and therefore their death experience is not like this, because as we see in the second line, in the event that none of their virtue remains, this is not the case for those gods who live a virtuous life in this way.
제사다 데니게 냠len 지간조라 난 개와 치마니 오마 개기 데니게 조사sem비게 동아디 야용고 말와 아니 데니게 지데디게 내가 디나신 강아 이기 말해 대시 지대가 시에서 디나신 건설에 대 지대 연도 용고할 때 디나신 강아디 이기 말해.
And for such gods, their experience as they approach death will not be like those of the other gods. In other words, the 5 signs of death, they do not cause suffering at all. They do not cause suffering in the same way, nor do they have any need to fear their next rebirth.
가르스네 디케바 하르센 직디다 개왕아마게 수남사비게 할레 계진 대원 용고야 지 개왕아메 수남세비 제부디게 제사 미네 제부디 롱주고르바 단 세딜리아 수남사바 사제 냠는 제메나 다데네기 아니 세딜리아 디빌리아가다 녀모베 샤와도 수는 녀모베 디바이 꺄냐 제바이나 디기다 제부디 가서 개와치 망가선을 개마도 요마르바 제사 디니 자다 치데디네 쇼하다 개와치 망가선을 개야기 동안 용고야기 디네 통여도 대강아지 지고르바 다데 베네 데네기 내중게 잠니제고 데네기 냠는 제는디게 개왕아마미 기위톱게네 덴돌레 할레게 디벨 할레게 디 류디 체델레 디기용 체델레양 개와 빠도메 바사네 인개와 치마이네 인디기 요아기 지게 하다미 개야게 데네기 레스처럼 사고요 바자 아니 데네기 돈에 강아메야디 디르바다 제사도 곧 디기 요아의 인주
Whomever takes rebirth in any realm, but here we talk about gods, does so in dependence on the causes accumulated in previous lives. So amongst them, those who attain rebirth in the god realms, all have attained rebirth there in dependence on extensive virtue. For some, whilst they are experiencing the ripening results of that extensive virtue, because of the imprints they've gained, they do not get overwhelmed by indulgence in the pleasures of this incredible rebirth, but they utilize their opportunity, their life, to continue their spiritual journey, continue to cultivate minds of the Dharma. And thereby, they can cultivate minds such as definite emergence, love, compassion, bodhicitta, and so forth, and thereby continue to accumulate extensive virtue. So when their death comes, the way they experience the signs of death are very different, and also their rebirth will not be in the lower realms. It will be either as a god or as a human.
So when they die, Dunga yoye ngudu nyomo bade pang mato ba ina ane hala ke ba ina nyomo wong yang nga sol ma ke che dene dunga nyonga chagre cheza dene enza hala ke ba ina dene ki nyomo ma pang ba ina dunga dene yungre cheza dene enza da dene ki chidi pho da ke wa chima gang du ke ne thon dunga nyonga di ke dene ki ke wang nyomo be le sa be wong di yungore dene enza da nga ju ge da nyomo bade pang go gore cheza da Nyomo mapana hale keba ina de mil keba ina dundro dio kawa keba ina kamsung kowa kandu keba ina dunga yoya mado tamalaya nyagab dewas myona tar dunga yangya yoya mado yomar chisa dunga le tara yomar de za dine za nyomo bade nyembo tenje nyomo bade banggudu chisa de deja khoro ngaje nyomo dian yoya so dasen marik badi 도시는 년보되는 빵 구도 선비데 도시는 빵 년보이 녀모바데 아주 코와 강도기에 동아이 유인바데 하고네 니 안에 년보된제 빵제 탈바 세 토부 그래서디 된되게 탈바 되냐 이게 깨다 녀모바 빵야게 주 녀모바데 빵야게 빵 구도 선비데 년보된 거야게 되네 하고와 된다라 할게 베네 강아진데 요래 nyoma ba 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 ne dine yore se ji disun go ji sa dine ye la le de gang a dine chong xie yo du o la le ke na dine hong du a jeng ma ba de dine la le ke ba nyoma ba ba dine gang a dine ta ya bin do ji sa da nyoma ba de bang gu du se be da nyoma ba yin bo dian jie ai tar ba de ni sam ba ji dine nyam le je gi dan da la ya do xie ne da le du a dine yore se song ye de di le jang an ju ge da ka sa o la le ke ne be ya ko da di sa le sem be ge di sam di go ma le se di le.
The meaning of this presentation then is that one is to further deepen the understanding that we should not be drawn by what we find delightful, by the delights, the pleasures of samsara, but recognize that even if one has unimaginable pleasures, achieved everything imaginable in terms of pleasures, that lasting happiness still hasn't been attained. The situation is impermanent. It will come to an end. When the causes that ripened into such a result, when they start to fade and cease, that situation will end. And once again, one's karma will determine one's next rebirth. So this is the situation for all beings in samsara. And again, the meaning here is through this reflection to come to an ever more stable recognition, not to be drawn to wanting delightful outcomes, pleasurable outcomes, recognizing that even the greatest of existence remains flawed, and remains flawed for the same reason that our own lives are flawed, because of our karma being contaminated by the afflictions and our habituation to the afflictions. So we take this reflection then and use it to stimulate our determination to abandon the afflictions, in particular, the root cause of all our suffering, the ignorance of self-grasping. In the same ways as described earlier, we take this recognition to develop a determined attitude, to accumulate virtue, to not come under the influence of the afflictions, and rather, through the accumulation of virtue and the abandonment of the afflictions, to strive for liberation, not to be distracted by pleasures and delights, but to remain focused on what is meaningful.
나 되네 빠공의 동아 세지 살이야 되는 거를 빠공의 동아 제단데 가르스네 내려야 쇠남기 풍부 치 제체보다 덴바 덴벨 하남라 뉘엔치 풀루 중화 남라 아니 풀루 중화라 아니 디 중화라 디 레이브 쇠남 중화 남기 통나 아니 빠공의 교신 시딜의 동아다 이미지 첨부 용화오스.
So on the previous page we saw the suffering of desire realm gods, and there's the suffering of dying transmigrating, which we've looked at, and now and the suffering of the lower abodes, we've looked at both of those. Now we come to the second, the suffering of jealousy. For the gods with extensive heaps of merit, the most exquisite sense pleasures arise. When the offspring of the gods with little merit see that, they envy them and experience acute suffering and mental unhappiness.
나包括是소소랑 심슈 차네 강아지 시월 심슈 차데 바 소바스는 로치보 베네 지금 바오시오라 바오스 로치보 예包括是기시월 지나데 디나데包括동아 세조르 와다 지금 包括现在开始要等到包括了呢开了我是呢소수기 심슈 차지 소소를也别소소 심슈 차네别뭐 차와들래 빠공와세요. 빠공와세는 차도 말에 빠공와세디. 빠공와세 소소소 빼지 뉴슐만 말 교보를 차는 소소소기 말 이가 갈소 샘슈 차지가 써지고 그걸 빠공와네. Pakongwa sene sososogi nushu meba sososogi gyoburi shiwuri sene sososogi ma chigi nushu ma cha dunga sorte semshu chawa dele kogore.
The term we have translated as jealousy should rather be translated as discouraged. So what it means then, so the suffering of discouragement is that the mind lacks confidence. One lacks a strength of mind. So that's quite different.
Pakongwa dire, dan does pakongwa sede. Jesa bene nga zuge chiro chine 지디바 지로 워친도 지압도 기전도 숙천부ले 말레도 람상고 셴바 이제데 빠공마 빠차서는데 빠세네 로워친부도 빠차바리다 빠워세네 로워친부래 그러와 진짜 빠공마 마 차서래고 진짜 니니게 차서 니난신 할이야 할디게 쇠남이 풍부 개천보 된별 하남라 뇌인 체풀루 중화라 지상 하산다디게 빼마서 수남 첨보 뒤엔 개첨보 빠도 매바 통요디 안에 회부 하가시 수남 소소 변조 충중라 수남 충주되게 가르통에서 콘솔레 디네도 나교버래도 와 선비게 콘솔레 뒤엔 디네도 콘솔 연대된 빼 콘솔레 변조 lonje 디네도 당 알카면도 와 선비 나교버래샤 선비 딘디게 심주 마 차야 되는 거래 지상 빠공화세 거네 소식이 뉴슐 마서는 마 도시에 차르고 레이브 쇠는 중화 남기 통화나 세네 또 니니고 콘주 변조 첨보다 인데 통화도 안에 빠공화 결심 아니 시텔에 되니게 빠가 교버생 하면도 선배섬기데 되네 마 빠공화네 되네 동화 셈을 맡기고 쉬운 거래 저래 다자데 레이부세다 간제 레이부스 민다로 하제다 레이부 뉴버 총화산 레이부라나 보마라나 다 간제 부나 보마니가 유로와 다 간제레 부부나시 민다고 레이부세 민다고 레이부 뉴버 총화 하 코론레 제로 뉴버 총선에 뉴버 총화 코론을 와 뉴버 총
So reading it again, and I'll just change this word, then envy. For the God...
Mi bulabdi mi inji mi budi mi budan boma labdi maringe jesa de nge samde jesa budan boma se inji mi bugul go yo mar bege to la budan boma labdi inji dal bugul labdi bu chungshul go yo wa bege to la pejna budan boma la yo inji mi bugu chungshul go yo mare budan boma labdi 개비릭들라 부 아니 지기 뭐여리데 부모스 빙다고라 지다 데라 롱업 주주 계주고 드라이어 부 아니 론니숨 드라이어라다 다양한 지딘 카갈라 부 충충세 부세네 한 충충래 고야요래 지단 부다 부모세데 나저기 디식디 인지미지 부 충충을 고고요 말에 부랍데 아니 개발 고고래 아니 부모라데 내가 이제 개발 많이 비기다 뭘 고고와 딜 고고 딜라 부다 보마세 된지 미 충충 인고 말에 만 부다 보마 딩 안주 삼르로 와 부기 파만 개발 시식으로 와 지단 부다 보마세 아마치레 개디 충충딜 고고고 말에세 다딩 아주 부다 보마세 직베다 저로와 개발라 부 개발 많이 벌 보모세 밍다 텔 로체션 다디 기쇼 말에제
The reading is just changing then this term envy in the third line. For the gods with extensive heaps of merit, the most exquisite sense pleasures arise. When the offspring of the gods, so maybe first talk about offspring. So this elsewhere will be translated as children. It's not the meaning. So the meaning is more just maybe not the same capacity, something like that. It doesn't mean like in the way the term is used in a family. It doesn't have that meaning, but not having perhaps the same capacity or prestige, this kind of thing. So lower in that sense. When the offspring of the gods with little merit see that they, instead of envy them, they see that, they become discouraged. They can discourage or lack confidence and experience acute suffering and mental unhappiness. So there's an analogy would be, if you think of a dog, and it's a very strong, brave dog, and it barks at whoever passes, and is perhaps aggressive, until another more dominant dog passes. Then suddenly that same dog rolls over and shows its belly, and in this way it recognizes it doesn't have what it takes in relation to the other dog. So this is then likened to the offspring of the gods. So they do not have the power and the capacity that the regular gods have, the other gods, and therefore their mind is discouraged or dispirited. And that mental attitude is from the analogy of the dog, in that they have cowardice isn't a nice word, but really this lack of confidence, lack of strength of mind. So this is what should rather be, instead of envy or jealousy, should be this discouragement. So this term translated here as offspring, we have it in the Heart Sutra. There as children of the lineage. When the old translation, it was sons of the lineage. The meaning isn't that. It isn't children as in they have parents and they have uncles, but rather that they are newer in the lineage of bodhisattvas. So similarly here, in terms of gods, then these are maybe of lesser capacity than those with the most exquisite sense pleasures, so perhaps of lesser merit. So this is really the meaning of offspring here, or children in the Heart Sutra.
파마레게 충충을 망하시 충충을 삼단거와 지나다 최진나를 베지 지당한테 베기는 보다 보말라도 인지미주 충충 파마레게 충충인 거요 말에 제가 최진나라시도 보다 보마시키시도 보다 보마시키시도 되니 인지미주 로충 파마레게 로충충인 거고 말다가 제래 가지 깨바다 깨바 많이 베티니게 니들라 니 보다 보마시키시단 거래 니래 다들 헤이부세다 헤이부세다 헤이부 충충 파마레게 뒤에 부 충충세데 삼다메레 제가 되지 아주 두셔래 제가 되네 헤이부세 하디 처럼 주게래 주게 게네시나는 아게 공게 저게 주게서와 될 하디 주게래 제 파마레게네 부 충충데야 차차차게 말해 하디게 끼어는 수부가 지나 다가란 내용 거래 같이 되네게 충충 첨보를 아니엘이 개바나 제를 개바서 수보를 지바 인사래.
So therefore, so in the Tibetan language, this term children or sons, the same word, in the Dharma context does not usually mean that, but more of what I'm describing here or in the Heart Sutra. Perhaps, so in this context, it would be those of without extensive heaps of merit. So it would be a diminutive in that sense, not in the way that we normally think of children. Well, children are born from parents, they have siblings. This isn't the meaning. That would also be the word offspring. So it doesn't mean this at all, because, for example, in this context here of gods, they aren't born from parents. They aren't born from the womb. Amongst the 4 types of rebirth, the rebirth is spontaneous. And when they are born fully formed. Not as children and then, not as infants and then toddlers and then children and then teenagers. This is not the case. They're born spontaneously, fully formed. So they don't go through this growth period. So therefore, understand that in these two contexts, here in terms of the God realms, as well as in the Heart Sutra, or perhaps in some other context, that when one sees a term translated as children or offspring or son, that the meaning is not necessarily that of in the normal family sense of the word.
충충을 말와 침보로와 지나디 안행한지 로침보차디데 아마디기 보머리에 바바디기 보머리에 그러와 이내 충충 말로 죽주지 계지도 진짜다 제가 로 죽주지 차상 부다 보머리에 근데 로 계주는 라 게타를 내리는 물에 부지는 물에 이제 보머리 부다 보머리 가선 그런 바바디를 깨와서 부다 보머 세상한테 부다 보머서 인지 미주 충줄로 고고요 말이야 아주 밀리 삼다네 아 네레 제자당 아주 밀리 삼다나 부다 보머서 인지 미주 충줄로 고고요 말이야 배선을 되는 슬람나 아주 롤리아 차디에요.
So it's good to understand this well. It's a bit off point here, but it helps give a greater clarity to some contentious points that come up in this, like this. Because in the Tibetan language, the word boy and girl is used throughout most of one's life. So I'm sitting here, I'm a boy, I have parents. Now in English, I would not call myself a boy. It would sound a bit ridiculous. We'd say male. But that word male or female does not exist in Tibetan. They just say the same word for boy and girl. So as a translator, of course, you change the word. But from the Tibetan perspective, it's the same word. So whether you're little or you in between, or you're not quite an old person, but like a grandparent age, but all in between, you're just a boy and a girl. And so therefore the usage of the term is really quite different. Hence, as the translator mentioned, there's no term male or female, which is what we would use in English. So the suffering here, to go back to the point, is this of discouragement, where one lacks confidence, a strength of mind. So this is the intense suffering that these gods without extensive heaps of merit have. The final suffering, so there are three sufferings for the suffering of desire on God, read on the previous page. In the middle, this is 3 points. This is the third, the suffering of being chopped up, split, killed, and banished. So now, reading the first sentence. When the gods fight with the demigods, they experience the suffering of having the limbs and minor body parts, so fingers and toes, chopped off, and suffering of their bodies being split, and the suffering of being killed. Continues, if their heads are chopped off, they die. So this is the only way gods can die in battle, from having their head severed. Whereas there's severe injuries, such as having their limbs and I think we'd say digits rather, cut off, these will spontaneously grow back. But the remaining limbs and, let's say, digits that are chopped off or split grow back and they survive. So the way they are killed is if their heads are severed. Final sentence as for banishment. When there is conflict, the more powerful gods drive the weaker offspring of the gods out of their abodes. So here we see a similar expression of what happens in other realms, where those with power express that power, use that power in an abusive way to those who lack that power. So in this way, they are banished or they are expelled from their homes. They lose their homes. They lose their abodes.
Bendigo
So one imagines that there's a god who, for them, this is their abode. Another god who is more powerful decides they want to expand their area. They come, they have battle, and the god that loses gets expelled. And they flee, leaving everything behind, because they've engaged in violent battle. The battle is lost, and they leave with their life, but nothing else. Everything is left behind, and now they need to find somewhere else that is empty, that they can live, because they're going there weak and wounded, and now they need to find somewhere that has no resident god to try and find a home again.
milke bana kanga yongore nyerwa dundrol ngasol kinanya halakina kanga yongore cheza kanga yoya gyudi nyomo badres cheza da deni gi nyomo ba yinza nyomo badi ji di wonge yongore cheza nyomo badi yoya gyu nyomo badi pango gores ta nyomo ba paala de cha khondro nga ja mari ba se de sig mongbu yebe nane da ngan juge nyomo pa yidu da namjine nga juge nyomo ba nega paala ya de khondro gi khondro ge paala sebo komya ane ji 체베 샬레야 체와체에 삼들이 아니 지게 류당 나다 이유고네 체와체야라 류가이스 예제된 배 수름송야 아니 지게 대다 녀모바 센나라서 바기에디 제나게 도죠 진배냠는지야 되네 정아주 취시에기 예로로 게디 디 도초래야 아니 철이야 아니 지게 냠는지에게 되녀기 좀 준비게야 언두시네 다시 남면 넘버 유 아니 지게 차한게 유를 봐 주지 남면 기어도 디 송야야 띵이죠 고미야 라서 누신의 검진에 냠는 제오래 스녀모바 두신의 송고고래 제다다 짐바 다 수름 송 쇠바 검진에 좀 something 냠는 제오래 다디는 녀모바데 파 자원에 제바 다스 녀모바 정해 유 녀모바 대샤 콘로가 영서 차상 다세 마릭바티네 용고래 다세 마릭바티 파빵야야 자원에 파 매바 쇠도 쇠고고래 디 쇠발이야 동방이 또제 동이 도비 제바지 또 다음에 봐 도비 동방이 도비 로디 검진 매바 쓰고래서 다디 만주게 가 되네게 강아 세트바이나 강아지 차산의 자살에서 되고래서 되네 자다 만주게 강아 되는데 요래 강아 디세게 탑람 되는데 요래 탑람 디두 지나가지고 냠내죠 되는데 지금 야게도 냠내 지고래서 다 디송고다 되네게 세대 탑람 되세 디 냠내 지고 되네 제나 아주 강아 세트 그래 띵이 되와 톱도 그래 되네 동아 남면 용모도 차도 그래 세대 다 도나 디송고다 지상 동아디기도 설라래게나 용 밀레기나 동아 이다 다녀와야 되네 요래서 동아디 파악 못해죠 다 동아 영화도 규를 가르치는 용것을 요마래다 요마벌네 용고래서 제자다 디 매버서야 탑로 여러에서 요래서 가르에서 진보출에서 버튼에서 내 시럽습니다 디두 냠내 제고래서 단이 냠내 제 냠내 자고 영화래 꿀롱을래 그 되네게 탑아 토부 되네 동아디 파 탈고도 선비 탈도게 삼바게 되네 탈도 삼바게네 이 타에게 탑름들 진소 두디 냠는 제들이에서 디 냠는 제바이나 거기 동안 타달라 자 두그래 되네 땡기 대와 게디네 대와니 대와마도 네 동안 용어에 자와기는 용 말해서 돼 나디 숨어다 다 동안 시에 거기 김자로 시대때 뭐 어제죠 지사 상여 주민들이 동안 시에바자 세 손에 디디디 하고 와지 되네 군주 봉화제 동안 유리 되네 갈하고 되네 방고 그래서
very purpose of the Buddha having taught this, Lama Tsongkhapa having included it in his presentation, and us spending time discussing it here, and you then including it in your meditation, is to strengthen the minds that we have been developing over the course of this year, which is to recognize that wherever one finds oneself within samsara, one is subject to suffering. So here in particular, in the context of the desire realm gods, the two outcomes to strive for, the outcomes to strive for, is to recognize that wherever one is in the desire realm, no matter how marvelous one's existence is, the afflictions remain, and therefore one suffers. And not only does one suffer, one creates the causes for further suffering, and through the expression of one's afflictions, one brings unhappiness into the lives of others. The purpose of this reflection is to get us to truly recognize there's nothing worth striving for that is to be found in cyclic existence that has any abiding essence. Even if we have the most abundance of excellences, we will still suffer because of the presence of the afflictions. So therefore, I need to let go of the afflictions. Wherever they arise and the direction they push me in towards what attracts me or away from what repulses me, those afflictions are deceptive. I need to abandon them. That's the first major recognition. The faults of samsara coming from these afflictions. And the way that I abandon them, the second major recognition, is through cultivating virtue, which means cultivating the virtuous ways of thinking. So in terms of generosity, wanting to give of myself, recognize truly in a balanced way what I have in abundance and helping those in need. And in terms of ethics, all expressions of harm, whether it's through ways of speaking, ways of acting, ways of thinking, these need to be restrained. I need to ensure, to the best of my abilities, I don't act under the influence of afflictions, guard my mind from criticizing and complaining, but rather recognize the good in others, the kindness in others, and thereby, with this mind of ethics, can express my generosity more sincerely. So too with patience. Through cultivating qualities such as generosity, wanting to bring good into the lives of others, ethics, not wanting to harm others, that aids the cultivation of patience, whereby one doesn't become disturbed in the face of adversity, one does not want to bring harm to others, but bring good to them. And we cultivate joyous perseverance, delight in virtue, recognizing our endeavors, taking delight in what we are doing. And to the extent we can, we try and concentrate our mind, and try to meditate, do these analytical meditations, bring our mind back from distraction to the topic of reflection. And if we have the training, engage in the cultivation of understanding reality. So in this way, we cultivate the causes that will lead us for freedom. And we generate an ever stronger determined attitude. I will gain freedom. The causes for freedom that I can develop, now I will. Those that I don't yet have the knowledge or skill in, I make aspiration that I meet those teachings and I can cultivate them. So these are the two parts. The one is developing a disenchantment and a revulsion for samsara. And the second is the outcome of that is the striving in virtue, the positive mind. And this is what we need to come to in our meditations. And this is how we can include the reflections on the God realms in these meditations.
당주기 가브리엘이야 데니게 동아라 지섬다 어다 동아지 셈마기 와서야지 지 가브리엘 삼다데 마기 용하게 내가 여러봐 이내다디 마기와 제가 가야마 데니게 삼다네 동아딩 아주 용하여 말이야 이래요 말 다딩 아주 데데데 진 데니게 삼 동아디게 삼다 얼하라나 동아 밀레데네 하라데 동아 요아서 데네 하고나 동아디 파 마요에게 제마나 베네 점리나 네엠 가르가르 요요보다 하고 보이나 네엠도 소소라 마요에게 소송공고지야 여러바다 네엠 가르가르 요마 하 먹어제 가와로는 지 하 먹어제 되나 맞지 조샤베네 네다마로 고네 소소 강아지 냥아 여러바 지산이 네데 데네 어디와네 룸바 나세 디요 디 네엠디게 룸바 가자가 네엠 담으로 요바 하고 보이나 안 될려 공고지에 송급제 소소기 마음반의 소소이디 강아지 채 먹어야 차고 디 나시리 다 디니기 열하르게나 강아 디니디 열 세상 디니기 마음반의 소소를 강아지 하고 와지 하고나 디니게 강아지에 세야 탑람다 강아지 마체에 다디는 아주 공고지에 제지지에 아주 고급 여바인사 디 야후여레스 세상 디니자 삼다지 한쪽이 도전 빼 야후를 디니 하고 빼 야후도 디니기 디니기 하고 제된 마음반의 디니 강아 채마체에 탑람라이 비수 지야 선비게 삼로지 땅고고래 제제 디니 삼다면은 한쪽이 강아세에게 탑로 여바래 디니 삼마다나 디니기 균에 만년반의 년유에 되어지 맞게반에 니 동안 가르가르 하모고 디니 셋업 가리마 하모고 디니 하모고는 한 마음반의 디강아 체지 내용으로 와.
Sorry, it's a bit over time, but I just want to make this final point. And because of this topic, it's important to make the statement again and again. All of us are the same in wanting happiness and be freed of suffering. So we have this natural aversion for suffering and wish for happiness. Therefore, this topic of suffering tends not to be anyone's favorite. We do not even want to think about suffering. But in your own daily life, you know when you have problems, you need to look at that problem so as to identify its cause and come up with solutions. And that is what this is about. We need to recognize, come to know suffering, so that we have the determined attitude to recognize its causes. And this is important so that we don't just merely know its afflictions, but when we recognize attachment drawing us to something and we want it, we recognize by pursuing that we are strengthening our attachment. Likewise with aversion, by following our aversion and expressing it, we may feel justified, but we are actually strengthening our causes for suffering. So by reflecting well on suffering, one will come to develop a revulsion for the afflictions themselves. And this is crucial, to have the strength of mind, or the self-discipline, not to follow the afflictions. So from knowledge, freedom will follow. Without knowledge, freedom cannot come. So I encourage you to do these meditations, and finally to make the point, to do them in a skillful way, where in each meditation session you spend time looking at suffering, but you ensure that the meditation concludes with the mind being powerful and positive by recognizing the need to cultivate the path, and therefore in the meditation cultivate virtuous minds of love, compassion, or patience, or generosity, so as to conclude the meditation with a virtuous mind, a positive mind rather than a mind being pushed in a negative direction by reflecting just on suffering.
Yeah, that's
Then thank you. We can conclude there for this week. And I think again, we meet again in 3 weeks' time. Thank you.